The heat of the June morning on Saipan was not merely tropical. It was the suffocating, dense heat of expectation, the kind of stillness that precedes the inevitable detonation of massive violence. It was the summer of 1944, and dawn had broken over the island, yet the darkness of what was to come lay heavy over the U.S. Marine perimeter, an invisible weight pressing down on every man. They stood braced at the mouth of one of the last, largest cave systems on the northern ridgeline, a jagged limestone labyrinth that inhaled the morning light and promised only death in return. Inside that system, hundreds of Imperial Japanese soldiers were waiting. Their silence was the most terrifying thing of all. Weeks of continuous bombardment, the relentless thunder of naval guns and the earth-shaking concussions of aerial strikes had failed to break the will of men pledged to fight to the last grenade, the last bayonet, the last breath. The Marine Command had meticulously rehearsed the final plan, a precise sequence of flamethrowers first, then white phosphorus grenades to burn out the dark pockets, followed by massive satchel charges to collapse the tunnels. It was scheduled to be a massacre, a brutal, inevitable bloodletting that everyone understood was the necessary price of this volcanic ground. The air was still, thick with the metallic scent of cordite and the dusty smell of shattered coral. Rifles lay ready in the low weeds. Officers peered through binoculars, searching the rock face for any tremor, any flash of muzzle fire that would signal the start. The operation was set to begin at 0800 hours. The tension was a palpable, living thing. Then, at 7:50, against the low crimson smear of the rising sun, a lone figure began to walk. He was a young Marine, barely 19, moving forward with an impossible, almost disrespectful calm. He was not a scout, nor an officer. He carried no flamethrower, no heavy pack of explosives. His M1 rifle was slung loosely over one shoulder, a gesture of carelessness that stunned the observers. The officers watched, frozen, their hands gripping their binoculars. The scouts braced for the sudden telltale crack of a Japanese rifle. No one spoke. The only sound was the quiet, deliberate crunch of his boots on the abrasive coral dust, a sound that in the vast, impending silence of the battlefield seemed impossibly loud. He was walking directly toward the line of caves, toward the unseen enemy, toward the expected doom. The enemy was waiting for a war of fire and steel. What they were about to receive was a conversation. The great campaigns of the Second World War are often defined by the scale of their machinery, the colossal tonnage of ships, the immense destructive reach of bombers, and the sheer, overwhelming weight of fire poured onto the enemy. The Pacific Theater, in particular, was an industrial grind of attrition, a relentless sequence of invasions that measured success not in territory gained, but in the grim certainty of body counts. On islands like Tarawa, Kwajalein, and Peleliu, the strategic formula was stark and unwavering: maximum industrial force applied against minimum surrender. This logic was not merely tactical, it was deeply cultural. American soldiers viewed the Japanese fighter through the lens of wartime propaganda and the brutal reality of combat experience, as a warrior bound by an absolute, unbreakable code. His duty was to die for the emperor, to reject capture as the deepest shame. This core concept, known as gyokusai, or the shattering of the jewel, was not an occasional act of defiance. It was a standing order, a point of ideological and military necessity imposed from Tokyo across the entire imperial command structure. For the U.S. planners, who had witnessed the uncompromising suicide charges, this meant that every single engagement was, by definition, an operation of extermination. They did not expect surrender. They expected a massacre. This expectation, this iron law of the Pacific War, made the events on Saipan an anomaly, a breach in the code of relentless violence that defined the island-hopping campaigns. The story of Private First Class Guy Gabaldon is not the narrative of a great general or a monumental weapon. It is the narrative of a single human being who understood the profound gap between political ideology and personal terror. Gabaldon's weapon was not the M1 Garand or the flamethrower. It was a simple, profound truth that before a soldier is a combatant, he is a man who fears death, and that fear speaks a universal language. But to reach that language, he first had to speak the enemy's. Over the course of the battle for Saipan, this 19-year-old Marine, alone and unarmed, would convince over 1,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians, men and women conditioned for suicidal resistance, to lay down their arms. He walked into the darkness of their caves and brought them back to the light. His story challenges the very foundation of the Pacific War's narrative, asking whether the true path to victory was always annihilation, or if sometimes the greatest act of courage was simply to talk. It is the narrative of how a battlefield massacre was averted, not by overwhelming firepower, but by the quiet, audacious power of empathy. Gabaldon's unconventional campaign forced a confrontation between the brutal logistics of war and the enduring fragility of human life, an opposition that would echo far beyond the coral reefs of the Mariana Islands. He was a human variable introduced into a machine of death, and the results were unprecedented. To understand how Guy Gabaldon could accomplish what the entire apparatus of the United States military could not, one must look not to the rigorous training camps of Paris Island, but to the dust-blown streets of East Los Angeles during the Great Depression. Gabaldon was born in 1926, a Mexican-American boy who, following a childhood tragedy and a tumultuous home life, found an unlikely second family in the Japanese-American community of his neighborhood. When he was 12, Gabaldon was effectively adopted by the Nakano family. They were not merely neighbors, they were his anchor. He lived with them, slept under their roof, and was immersed completely in their culture. Lyle Nakano, in particular, became his brother, mentor, and linguistic instructor. In the Nakano home, the culture of Japan was not an abstract, distant land, nor was it the wartime enemy. It was the texture of daily life, the meticulous rituals of respect, the careful preparation of food, the cadence of the language itself. Gabaldon learned to eat their food, observe their customs, and, most critically, speak their language fluently. This was not the formal, stilted language of military intelligence. It was the vernacular, conversational Japanese of family, respect, and commerce. This was the language of life, not of war. The Nakano family and Gabaldon's connection to them placed him in a profound ideological conflict the moment the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. The attack shattered the relative peace of their existence. The Nakano family, like over 100,000 other Japanese Americans on the West Coast, were soon swept up in the pervasive fear and codified prejudice of Executive Order 9066 and interned in camps. Gabaldon himself was classified as Caucasian, spared the camps, but forced to watch the only family he truly knew vanish behind barbed wire and official suspicion. He was left in an America that demanded he hate the language he spoke and the culture he loved. He carried this crushing paradox with him when he joined the U.S. Marine Corps in 1943. The Marine Corps was an institution defined by its singular purpose, relentless, disciplined, offensive combat. It was a culture that valued aggression, firepower, and unbreakable morale. There was no manual for negotiation in the face of Japanese fanaticism. There was no training for cultural outreach. Gabaldon's linguistic ability was noted on paper, but in the context of a war where the enemy was widely believed to fight to the last man, it was seen as a curiosity, perhaps even a liability, certainly not a weapon. The standard operating procedure for entrenched Japanese positions was the methodical application of overwhelming force, fire, and steel. The Japanese war machine, however, had its own deeply entrenched cultural and ideological design. The Imperial Japanese Army's belief system was rooted in a reinterpreted concept of Bushido, the ancient warrior's code, but warped for the modern era. The core was the absolute centrality of the emperor and the utter rejection of capture. Surrender was not merely a military loss, it was a spiritual defilement that brought eternal shame upon the warrior's family and ancestry. The Japanese military leadership promoted this doctrine with fanatical rigor, convinced that their soldiers' willingness to die was their ultimate non-industrial advantage against the overwhelming logistical power of the Americans. This cultural framework manifested tactically in the construction of defenses across the Pacific. On Saipan, the Japanese did not merely dig hasty trenches, they built elaborate, mutually supporting networks of limestone caves and tunnels, reinforced with concrete and artillery positions, designed for final, unyielding bastions. The island's unique geology, sharp, fossil-rich coral stone and hard limestone, allowed for deep excavation, creating subterranean fortresses that were almost impervious to conventional artillery fire. They were engineered for protracted subterranean defense, built on the premise that the soldiers inside would prefer to commit mass suicide or launch a final suicidal banzai charge rather than emerge and surrender. The design of the defense was an expression of the ideology. It was a fortress built around the certainty of death. The stage was set for the inevitable collision between the American industrial machine, designed for overwhelming force, and the Japanese cultural machine, designed for fanatical attrition. Both sides were locked into a cycle of mutual catastrophic expectation. Gabaldon was the single element that did not fit the design on either side. He spoke the language of one while wearing the uniform of the other. His presence was a cultural short-circuit waiting to happen. The battle for Saipan began on June 15, 1944. The island, a strategic jewel, lay at the heart of the Mariana Chain, placing the industrial core of Japan within range of the new, immense B-29 Superfortress bombers. Its capture was not optional, it was essential, and the price demanded was immediate and immense. The initial landings were catastrophic and costly. The Marines of the 2nd and 4th Divisions faced ferocious, organized resistance from entrenched positions, losing nearly 2,000 men in the first 72 hours alone. The combat was unlike anything the Americans had yet encountered. The enemy was invisible, firing from coral outcrops and hidden spider holes, melting away only to launch devastating, meticulously planned night counterattacks. The jungle terrain, the relentless, debilitating heat, and the constant, unnerving danger of an unseen enemy fighting with absolute disregard for their own lives wore down the U.S. forces rapidly. The Japanese commitment to Gyokusai was evident in every skirmish. Even wounded soldiers would refuse medical aid, choosing instead to detonate a grenade against their own chest rather than be taken. Prisoners were almost non-existent. Those who were captured were often too badly wounded to resist. This grim reality only reinforced the American doctrine. Talk was useless. Negotiation was an illusion held by those who did not understand the Japanese mind. The only way to take the island was to kill every last soldier on it, a hard, brutal necessity, driven by the enemy's own refusal to yield. This environment of absolute murderous certainty was where Gabaldon found himself. A young private first class in the 2nd Marine Regiment, he was quickly exposed to the full, brutal measure of the fighting. His unique linguistic skills were noted, but they were almost universally ignored or dismissed by the veteran command.
When he first tentatively suggested using his Japanese to call for surrenders, he was met with a mixture of polite dismissal and outright ridicule. The idea was seen as wildly impractical, if not dangerously naive. He was a rifleman, a common grunt, not an intelligence officer trained in psychological operations. His command saw a war where an act of courage meant charging a machine gun nest with a fixed bayonet or plunging a flamethrower nozzle into a dark hole, not walking up to it and speaking. Combat doctrine demanded confrontation, not conversation. He was often mocked, quietly, by hardened combat veterans who saw his linguistic ability as soft, perhaps even a sign of misplaced loyalty, given the context of the Nakano family's internment. They were soldiers trained to deal with absolutes. The idea of empathy or negotiation with an enemy who had just bayoneted your friend was unthinkable. Why would any rational soldier risk his life walking toward an enemy who at best would mock him with a volley of Japanese insults and at worst kill him instantly? The idea was viewed as a romantic delusion, entirely unsuited for the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of island warfare. Meanwhile, the Japanese high command escalated their fanatical instructions. Leaflets dropped over U.S. lines by the Japanese declared that every American soldier would be captured and killed, a testament to their own absolute resolve. Inside the caves, commanders were explicitly ordering soldiers to prepare for mass suicide rather than allow capture. The narrative was cemented on both sides. Two irreconcilable ideologies were meeting on a volcanic island, and the outcome could only be measured in extinction. The fighting reached its brutal, desperate climax around Mount Tapochau and the northern tip of the island, where the remaining Japanese forces, now heavily mixed with civilian non-combatants, men, women, and children, had retreated into the massive interconnected cave systems. The U.S. command prepared for the final, bloody phase. It was to be the final, necessary sacrifice. The Marines expected to lose hundreds. The Japanese expected to die to the last person. It was into this atmosphere of predetermined carnage and absolute ideological stalemate that Gabaldon, driven by a conviction that felt more like instinct than strategy, and effectively disobeying the spirit, if not the letter, of command, made his decision to walk out of the line alone and choose a fundamentally different way. He had seen enough death and understood that the fire and steel approach had reached its cultural limit.
The air around the northern caves was thick with the smell of old smoke, the sharp metallic odor of expended ammunition, and the cloying scent of fear. The sun had fully crested, baking the coral ridge into an abrasive, blinding white glare. Gabaldon, having secured 2 captured Japanese guards as reluctant messengers, now stood at the lip of a ravine that led into the deepest, most secure cave system on the island. He had bypassed the rigid chain of command, relying instead on the simple, powerful authority of his own conviction. He knew the calculus the Marines were running: hours of costly engagement, hundreds of American casualties, and the guaranteed gruesome deaths of everyone inside. He also knew the Japanese perspective: humiliation, torture, and a dishonorable death awaited them if they surrendered to the hated Gaijin. His task was not to defeat an enemy. It was to bridge an ideological chasm that was deeper than the Pacific itself, a chasm guarded by fear and fanaticism. He took a deep breath of the hot, humid air and began to shout. He did not use the formal, hostile language of the military manual. He used the language of the Nakano family. He called out in clear, fluent Japanese, a voice that carried surprisingly well across the dead, sun-bleached landscape, echoing off the limestone cliffs. He spoke first to the soldiers, addressing them not as enemy combatants, but as men trapped by circumstances.
He spoke with authority, detailing the utter futility of the resistance, painting a grim but factual picture of the crushing weight of American forces that surrounded them, the continuous naval power, the endless supply of ammunition and manpower. He did not threaten immediate violence, he threatened the inevitability of ultimate defeat. But he moved quickly past pure tactics. He spoke of the American hospitals, of guaranteed food, of clean water, simple necessities that the people hiding in the caves had been deprived of for weeks. He called out the names of the 2 messengers he had secured, men who were now alive and safe, an immediate, irrefutable proof of his claims, a living repudiation of their propaganda. Then he shifted his focus. This was the moment of his profound instinctive genius. He began to speak directly to the civilians. He knew that the soldiers were bound by the code of Bushido, but the civilians, the women, the children, the elderly hiding in the dark, damp limestone, were bound by the code of life and family survival. He spoke of their children's hollowed eyes and dehydrated bodies. He used colloquial, respectful terms that resonated with their deep sense of duty and filial piety, oiko, turning the idea of a suicidal death into an irresponsible act of familial abandonment. He reframed the act of living as the true duty to the emperor, arguing that only through survival could the family line, and thus the nation, endure. For almost half an hour he stood there, pouring out a torrent of persuasive language, his voice beginning to grow ragged from the effort and the dust. It was a soliloquy of profound cultural understanding, mixing strategic facts with relentless moral pressure. The silence from the caves was absolute, the weight agonizing for the Marines watching from the ridge. They squinted, their fingers resting lightly on their triggers, convinced that any moment would bring the flash of a rifle barrel or the telltale thud of a grenade landing. Then a sound, a hesitation, a shuffling in the darkness. A single Japanese officer, his uniform shredded, his face a mask of exhaustion and disbelief, stepped slowly out of the cave mouth. He held no weapon. He was followed by a cluster of 5 or 6 soldiers, their eyes hollowed by weeks of starvation and fear. They stared at the lone American, this young man speaking their mother tongue, a tongue reserved for intimacy and home, on this alien battlefield. Gabaldon did not flinch. He walked slowly toward the officer, closing the gap in the no-man's land. He didn't offer a handshake, an insult that would have suggested equality. Instead, he maintained a respectful, firm demeanor, repeating his promise of safe passage and fair treatment. He was not ordering a surrender. He was offering a choice, a path back to humanity that their own commanders had denied them. He pointed toward the American lines, assuring them of clean hands and quiet passage. The dam broke. First, it was a trickle of bewildered individuals, then a slow, agonizing flow. Civilians emerged, mothers carrying limp, dehydrated children wrapped in tattered cloth, elderly men weeping silently as the sun hit their faces, their features etched with the dust of the caves. They were followed by soldiers, some barely able to walk, others discarding their weapons with a look of profound, exhausted relief. The glint of relief in their eyes replaced the cold, dead look of fanaticism. In that single, astonishing incident, Gabaldon secured the surrender of approximately 800 Japanese soldiers and over 1,000 civilians. A complex, entrenched system of death designed to withstand the full might of U.S. artillery and explosives had collapsed. It had not been broken by steel, but by a sound. It was an act of personal, unconventional heroism that transcended military strategy and became a moment of pure human revelation. The men on the ridge, who had expected a massacre, watched in stunned silence as a stream of the enemy, now simply people, walked into the sun. The profound success of Guy Gabaldon's method lay in its perfect counterpoint to the established military and psychological logic of the Pacific War. The American approach was defined by an engineering philosophy, the massive application of industrial technology to overcome resistance. Flamethrower tanks, like the specialized M4A3 Sherman tanks, known by their official designation, POA CWS H5, or sometimes Zippo tanks, with their capacity to project liquid fire hundreds of yards, were the primary technical solution for clearing caves. They were tools designed to negate the tactical advantage of entrenched Japanese positions, turning dark, defensive spaces into lethal, inescapable furnaces. This technology worked by exploiting a physical truth. Limestone caves, once sealed, become perfect pressure cookers. But this solution was fundamentally flawed when confronting the deeply held cultural imperative of Gyokusai. The flamethrower guaranteed a rapid, gruesome death, which, to the fanatical Japanese soldier, was not a deterrent, but the promised honorable outcome. The use of fire merely reinforced the Japanese commander's propaganda that the Americans were merciless, fire-breathing demons who offered only brutal death. It cemented the belief that suicide, or the final banzai charge, was the only path to dignity and spiritual purity. The machine's power reinforced the fanaticism. Gabaldon's tactic, however, bypassed the physical defense entirely and targeted the psychological foundation of the resistance. His true technology was his linguistic and cultural fluency, a deep, intuitive understanding of Japanese societal dynamics. His speech was not a literal translation of American military terms of surrender. It was an application of deep psychological warfare rooted in anthropology. He understood the hierarchy of values within the cave. At the top was the abstract concept of the emperor and the rigid code of Bushido. But directly beneath that was the profound value placed on family, on the continuance of the line, and on social cohesion. By speaking directly to the civilians, the mothers, the elders, the non-combatant population, he introduced an external pressure point that the military doctrine had not accounted for and could not easily dismiss. When Gabaldon spoke, he used culturally resonant terms, invoking the concept of okizoku, the honorable return home, and focusing on the responsibility of the father and son. This framing presented surrender not as a personal military defeat, but as a moral victory of family preservation over political fanaticism. He effectively forced the Japanese military leaders within the cave to choose between two competing, profound moral imperatives: their abstract duty to the emperor, which led to death, or their concrete duty to their people and their future, which led to life. Furthermore, his method was inherently logistical and strategically efficient. The Japanese defense relied on exhausting the attackers and forcing an advance into a killing zone. Gabaldon inverted this equation. By walking in alone, he created an immediate, profound contradiction. He was the hated enemy, yet he spoke like a relative. He offered life, yet he was utterly vulnerable. The very fact that he stood there, unarmed and unafraid, shattered the propaganda image of the savage American and created a moment of profound doubt that no machine could replicate. This was less a tactic than a revelation of human vulnerability. The Japanese were trained to fight an engine of war, a faceless industrial juggernaut of steel and fire, but they were forced to grapple with a person offering a choice. The soldiers, malnourished, dehydrated, and terrified by the grinding reality of defeat, had reached their human limit. Gabaldon's voice, speaking their language of home and family, provided the psychological off-ramp they desperately needed, an honorable justification for an act their commanders had forbidden. His success proved that the industrial scale of the Pacific War, the relentless application of steel and fire, could be momentarily neutralized by a single, perfectly aimed emotional appeal. It was a victory of cultural insight over technological might.
The immediate, stunning success of Gabaldon's first mass surrender was not a one-off miracle. It quickly became an operational model, repeated by Gabaldon himself across the remaining days of the battle for Saipan. His actions profoundly altered the final stage of the campaign, moving U.S. forces away from a grinding attrition and toward a more focused, rapid conclusion. General Holland M. Smith, the overall commander of the invasion force, an experienced Marine known for his toughness, was initially skeptical, viewing the surrender as an incredible but anomalous event. However, as Gabaldon continued his isolated, dangerous sorties, the tactical and logistical advantage became undeniable. Every surrender he secured saved the lives of Marines who would have been lost in the brutal process of cave clearing. More importantly, in the context of the strategic war, it saved time, a commodity far more valuable than gold. Gabaldon was given a two-man escort, ostensibly for his protection, but often simply to retrieve the captured groups, and the unofficial license to continue his unique work. His method became a streamlined, repeatable process. He would approach a known cave entrance, often under cover of the confusing darkness of pre-dawn, and shout his message. He would sometimes leave conspicuous amounts of food and clean water just outside the entrance, simple, undeniable, material proof of the resources the Americans possessed, a silent contradiction to the promises of death from their own commanders. The combination of his persuasive, culture-sensitive speech and the undeniable physical evidence of American strength proved devastatingly effective. In one crucial instance, U.S. forces from the 8th Marine Regiment were desperately bogged down near a strategic ridge, an elevated position that gave the entrenched enemy a commanding view over the entire northern sector. The Japanese defenders were dug into a complex system of interlocking caves, the position deemed too costly to assault before nightfall, which would have allowed the enemy time to reorganize. Gabaldon was brought forward, his presence a last-minute gambit. After several tense hours of calling into the darkness, focusing heavily on the plight of the hundreds of civilians he knew to be sheltered alongside the remaining soldiers, he emerged with hundreds of combatants and non-combatants in tow. The entire strategic position, which could have cost dozens of lives and hours of fighting, was suddenly cleared without a single shot fired. This allowed the Marines to bypass a prepared defense and seize the objective before the Japanese could mount a secondary line of resistance. This pattern repeated itself with relentless efficacy. Gabaldon became a psychological battering ram against the Japanese resolve. The sheer volume of his success, ultimately responsible for the capture of over 1,500 people, the vast majority of them combatants, began to create its own internal propaganda within the remaining Japanese forces. Word began to filter through the captured ranks and back toward the remaining holdouts that the Americans were not the devils of their propaganda. The presence of the Pied Piper of Saipan, as he was soon dubbed by American press, a lone Marine who spoke the language of compassion and offered safe passage, provided a psychological anchor point for surrender that no general could have ordered and no weapon could have created. The impact of this unconventional method rippled out beyond Saipan itself. Military planners realized that a rigid, one-size-fits-all approach to the Pacific enemy was strategically insufficient. The potential for securing prisoners, not just eliminating them, represented a massive operational gain, not only saving U.S. lives, but also providing vital intelligence that could shorten future campaigns.
Gabaldon's lone initiative forced a subtle but critical recognition that the ultimate strength of a fighting force lies not in its technology of destruction, but in its understanding of the enemy's core, terrified humanity.
The capture of Saipan was never fundamentally about the island itself. It was about the air above it. The strategic imperative for this costly campaign was the establishment of air bases for the new B-29 Superfortress bomber. To fully comprehend the gravity and scale of Gabaldon's actions, one must pull back and view the entire immense architecture of the war machine that converged on this small Pacific landmass. The B-29 was the most complex, expensive, and logistically demanding weapon system of the entire war. Its production was an epic undertaking, a triumph of American industrial might, involving massive assembly plants across the American heartland, from Wichita to Seattle. Each superfortress, a technological marvel capable of carrying immense bomb payloads over intercontinental distances, represented millions of man-hours and thousands of tons of aluminum, refined petroleum, and specialized components. The entire structure of the 20th Air Force was being prepared to launch from the Marianas, tasked with striking the industrial heart of the Japanese Empire, a target previously untouchable by conventional means. Saipan was the absolute linchpin. Without Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the B-29 campaign against the Japanese home islands could not commence. Every single day the fighting dragged on was a day the Japanese industrial base continued to operate at full capacity, a day that extended the war, and a day that cost the lives of thousands of U.S. servicemen who were preparing for the inevitable, brutal invasion of the Philippines and the Japanese mainland. Gabaldon's actions, then, had a value that can be measured on a truly industrial scale. By convincing over 1,000 combatants to surrender, he did not just save the lives of those men, he directly contributed to the rapid, ahead-of-schedule conclusion of the Saipan campaign. Each pocket of resistance he cleared without engaging a Marine rifle squad represented time saved. This time was immediately converted into logistical velocity. The faster the island was fully secured, the sooner the U.S. Navy Seabees could land their earth-moving equipment and begin pouring millions of cubic yards of concrete for the massive B-29 runways. The difference between a drawn-out, attritional campaign and a rapid, surgically precise conclusion could be measured in weeks. Weeks that translated directly into earlier bomber raids against Japanese factories, foundries, and ports. This was a classic contrast in military power. The Japanese relied on fanatical, zero-sum resistance, designed to bleed the U.S. war machine of its men and materiel and force a protracted negotiated peace. The Americans relied on overwhelming industrial-scale logistics to simply render resistance impossible over the long term. Gabaldon's unconventional tactic was so successful because it achieved the desired strategic outcome, the rapid seizure of critical ground, without expending the precious industrial resources, ammunition, lives, aircraft fuel, and time that the traditional approach demanded. He was a human variable that disrupted the industrial equation. His voice was more efficient than a flamethrower, more effective than 100 pounds of TNT. The cost of his operation was 0 lives lost on the U.S. side, 0 ordnance expended, and only the time it took him to walk the distance. In a war defined by the scale of its production, of ships, of planes, of men, Gabaldon introduced an economy of force based entirely on moral courage and cultural intelligence. His success was not just a humanitarian victory, it was a profound logistical accelerator in the larger framework of the Pacific War's industrial, strategic march toward the ultimate conclusion.
The immediate aftermath of the Saipan campaign saw Gabaldon's extraordinary actions met with a complex mixture of awe, disbelief, and institutional discomfort. He had delivered a tactical and humanitarian victory of immense proportions, but his methods were unorthodox,
messy, and did not fit the rigid, established narrative of the heroic combat Marine. Initially, his command nominated him for the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest recognition for valor. The recommendation, however, hit a wall of institutional resistance. His victory had been achieved not by killing, but by talking, not by aggressive action that inflicted casualties, but by personal risk and empathy that prevented them. The highest award for combat valor was reserved for men who performed acts of singular aggression under direct, hostile fire. Gabaldon's victory was singular, but it was one of negotiation, not annihilation, an act of psychological warfare that defied the Marine Corps' conventional definition of heroism. Ultimately, the nomination was controversially downgraded, and he received the Silver Star, the third highest award for valor. The reasoning was technical, but the moral irony was stark. The man who had saved the lives of over 1,000 people was judged less heroic than those who had fought and killed to save a handful of their comrades. It would take decades and a concerted push by veterans and activists before his award was finally upgraded to the Navy Cross in 2005. Beyond the military decoration, the true consequence of his actions lay in the human costs he prevented. The civilians he secured were transferred to internment camps under U.S. control, spared the horrific final days of the Saipan campaign, which culminated in mass suicides at the infamous Marpi Point, where hundreds of Japanese citizens threw themselves from the cliffs rather than face capture. Gabaldon's work saved thousands of Japanese civilians from the final fanatical choice. He created a sanctuary, a zone of safety, that stood in stark contrast to the despair that consumed the rest of the island's non-combatant population. Gabaldon himself struggled immensely to adapt to life after the war. The immense weight of responsibility, the constant peril, and the sheer psychological burden of walking alone into the face of a fanatic enemy were not easily shed. He was not a celebrated warrior in the traditional sense. He was an anomaly who had glimpsed the true, terrified faces of the enemy, the men, women, and children, and could not easily forget them. He had seen the ultimate moral irony of the conflict, that the greatest victory was often the one where no blood was shed at all. The dissonance between his profound humanitarian success and the institution's limited recognition was a burden he carried for the remainder of his life. His legacy is not merely about the number of surrenders he secured, but about what he represented, a testament to the power of cultural bridges in a war designed to destroy them. The Mexican-American Marine raised by a Japanese family fighting for America used the language of his adopted family to save the lives of his country's enemy. It was a profound, unspoken statement about the nature of identity, loyalty, and empathy, a statement that the U.S. military establishment, focused on the immediate demands of combat, was not yet ready to fully receive or reward.
The war in the Pacific would continue its relentless trajectory of violence for another year, culminating in the immense, blinding atomic fire of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The great industrial machine of America ground onward, completing its mission through overwhelming force and devastating technology. The lesson learned on Saipan, the lesson of empathy, would be largely forgotten in the face of the ultimate geopolitical necessity of total victory. But on Saipan, in the quiet aftermath of the final patrols, Guy Gabaldon stood apart. His act was a moment of profound human interruption in the endless, automated process of war. He proved that even when two vast ideological armies are locked in a death grip, the will of a single individual, armed with empathy and understanding, can momentarily override the machinery of annihilation. His story remains the enduring challenge to the narrative of total war. It suggests that even in the face of absolute programmed fanaticism, humanity,
The fear of death, the love of a child, the desire for clean water remains the universal exploitable vulnerability. The enemy expected fire, they expected steel, they expected a massacre. What they received was a young man speaking to them in the language of their mothers, offering a path that was not shame, but life. The coral dust of Saipan has long since settled over the wreckage of the battle. The air bases he helped secure launched the bombers that ended the war. Yet the memory of the Pied Piper remains a quiet, powerful echo, a final, necessary truth. A man who in the hellish noise of the Pacific War chose to speak. And in doing so, he taught a civilization consumed by conflict a lesson that was desperately needed. That sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is not to fight, but to choose survival for all.